From the streets to a millionaire's heart. How does an unlikely encounter change two lives forever? Drop a wow in the comments to let us know you're here and tell us where you're tuning in from. Like and comment with your thoughts as we dive into this incredible story. Lucas Collins walked into the coffee shop, his heart racing. In his hand, he held a small velvet box containing the most expensive ring he had ever purchased. He was certain this night would change his life. The table was reserved, the setting perfect, discreet and cozy, just the way Charlotte, his girlfriend, liked it. Everything had to be flawless. Charlotte arrived a few minutes later, her smile radiant. She looked impeccable as always. Lucas stood up, kissed her hand, and they sat down. Their conversation was light, but he could barely focus. Finally, he took a deep breath, pulled the box from his pocket, and opened it, revealing the ring. "Charlotte, will you marry me?" Her smile vanished instantly. The silence that followed felt like time had frozen. Charlotte looked at Lucas and shook her head. "Lucas, I can't do this," she said firmly. "You're an amazing man, but you're never really here. You're always working, always busy. I don't want to marry someone who's far away, even when they're close." She stood up, grabbed her purse and left, leaving Lucas alone at the table. He sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. The rejection echoed in his mind, mixed with humiliation. Without saying a word, he paid the bill and stepped outside. The rain had started to fall then, cold. Lucas wandered aimlessly, clutching the small box in his hand. He felt empty, as though everything he thought he had built was crumbling. That's when he saw a young woman sitting on a street corner. She had messy hair and worn-out clothes, holding a piece of cardboard that read, "Hungry? Please help." Lucas paused for a moment, watching her. She looked so young, so out of place in the dark, wet streets. Driven by a mix of frustration and impulse, he took the box out of his pocket and walked up to her. "Here, take this," he said, handing her the ring. Before she could respond, he turned and began to walk away. Grace, the young homeless woman, looked at the ring in her hands. It was the most brilliant and valuable thing she had ever seen. But something didn't feel right. Why would a stranger give something so expensive to someone like her? Without thinking, she stood up and ran after him. "Hey, wait!" Grace called out, catching up to Lucas. "You just give me this." Lucas stopped, confused, and turned to face her. "Why not?" "You can sell it and get enough money to get off the streets." "I can't take this," Grace said, holding the ring back out to him. "It's not mine. I didn't earn it. It's not right." Lucas narrowed his eyes, surprised by her resolve. He had expected her to simply accept it and move on. But here she was, refusing a gift that could solve her immediate problems. "Why are you giving it back? This could change your life." "Maybe," Grace replied firmly, "but I don't need something like this. I don't want people looking at me and thinking I stole it. I can't carry something that isn't mine." Lucas stood silent, studying the young woman before him. She had a weary but determined look, and her honesty disarmed him. He sighed, shaking his head. "Fine, you win. But at least let me buy you lunch. You're hungry, aren't you?" Grace hesitated. She didn't trust strangers, especially well-dressed, wealthy men who appeared out of nowhere. But her empty stomach protested, and the offer seemed sincere. "All right, but just because I'm hungry," she said, crossing her arms. Lucas motioned to a small nearby diner, and the two went inside. As they sat, Grace kept a wary eye on him, trying to figure out his sudden kindness. Lucas, on the other hand, couldn't stop looking at her, intrigued by the strength she carried despite having clearly lost so much. The chapter ends with Lucas asking his first question. How did someone so young end up here? Grace hesitated before answering. Lucas expected something simple, but he quickly realized that any answer she gave would carry a depth he wasn't prepared for. After a few moments of silence, she took a deep breath, staring at the bowl of warm soup he had ordered for her. "It didn't happen overnight," she finally said. "I grew up in a troubled home. My dad drank. My mom worked all the time trying to keep things afloat, but it was never enough. When I was 15, my dad left us." Lucas crossed his arms, listening carefully. He didn't interrupt, which surprised Grace. Usually, people didn't bother to hear her out. "My mom tried to keep things together, but she got sick. I dropped out of school to take care of her. We managed to get by somehow until she passed." Grace's voice faltered for a moment, but she quickly composed herself. "After that, the bills piled up, and before I knew it, I was out on the streets." Lucas frowned, trying to process what she had said. He couldn't imagine someone so young going through so much. At the same time, he felt a pang of guilt. He had everything, and still found reasons to complain about life. "And you never tried asking for help?" he asked, not realizing how naive the question sounded. Grace let out a dry laugh and shook her head. "Do you think it's easy? Do you think people care? Most just look the other way. When they do help, it's usually because they want to look good in front of others, but they rarely do anything that actually matters." Lucas stayed silent, feeling the weight of her words. Grace continued, "Maybe that's why I was so surprised when you showed up with that ring. It didn't feel real. People like you don't help people like me without expecting something in return." "And you think I wanted something?" Lucas asked, curious. "I don't know, maybe. But I don't think that's the case," Grace shrugged. And that just made it more confusing. Lucas sighed, leaning his elbows on the table. He looked at the young woman in front of him and noticed that her gaze was different, like she could see through the layers he usually showed the world. "To be honest, I don't know why I did it either," he admitted, glancing out the window. "Maybe it was just the weight of the moment. My girlfriend just turned down my marriage proposal." Grace raised her eyebrows in surprise. "You were going to get married?" "I thought I was, at least. I thought so." He let out a humorless laugh. "But she said no, said I'm absent, that I'm not really present." Grace gave a small smile, which Lucas found unexpected. "Well, she's not entirely wrong, is she?" Lucas looked up at her, surprised by her bluntness. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean, you seem like a man who has everything, but at the same time, you have nothing." Grace met his eyes. "I'm not saying this to insult you. It's just, you're here, but it feels like your mind is somewhere else." Lucas didn't reply. He was used to being praised, admired, even envied, but no one had ever spoken to him like that. Grace's brutal honesty disarmed him in a way he couldn't explain. "Maybe you're right," he admitted finally. Grace took a few more spoonfuls of soup, savoring each bite as if it were a luxurious meal. Lucas watched her with curiosity. "And now, what are you going to do?" she asked. "I don't know. Maybe go home and keep pretending everything's fine. That's what I do best." Grace smiled faintly, but said nothing. Lucas shifted the focus of the conversation. "And you? What do you plan to do next?" Grace shrugged. "Survive. Isn't that enough?" Lucas frowned. Her answer bothered him more than he expected. It was as if she had resigned herself to the idea that survival was the best she could hope for, and that unsettled him. "Surviving shouldn't be enough for anyone," he said, crossing his arms. "You deserve more than that." Grace looked at him with a mix of surprise and disbelief. "And what do you know about deserving?" she asked, her voice low but firm. "People like you have everything handed to them. People like me have to fight for every scrap." Lucas opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. She was right. He knew nothing about that kind of struggle. Still, he felt he couldn't just walk away and leave her there as if nothing had happened. "Maybe I don't know," he admitted. "But that doesn't mean you should settle for less than you deserve." Grace sighed and finished her soup. Lucas stood up to pay the bill, and when he returned, he looked at her as if making a decision. "Listen, I don't know what made me approach you today, but I think we can do something different." "Different how?" Grace asked, skeptical. "I can offer you a job. It's not much, but it's something. Work at my house for a while until you can get back your feet." Grace's eyes widened in surprise. "Are you serious?" "I am." Grace hesitated, considering what accepting such an offer would mean. But when she looked at Lucas, she sensed something genuine in his proposal. "Okay, but on one condition." "What condition?" "I don't want charity. If it's not real work, I'd rather stay where I am." Lucas smiled slightly, impressed by her determination. "Fair enough. So, do we have a deal?" Grace took a deep breath before answering. "We do." Lucas extended his hand for a handshake, and Grace accepted it. As Grace walked alongside Lucas, her heart felt heavy. The contrast between the two of them was striking. He, dressed in a sharp suit, walking with confidence. She, in worn clothes, her body slightly hunched as if carrying the weight of a lifetime of struggles. Yet, there was something about his invitation that felt genuine. Maybe it was the absence of judgment in his eyes, or the way he seemed more lost than she had imagined. "Hey, what do you think of Lucas and Grace so far? Smash that like button if their story's hitting you in the feels, and drop your thoughts below." When they arrived at the entrance of a luxurious building, Grace stopped abruptly. "Wait, is this where you live?" she asked, looking at the imposing glass and marble facade. Lucas turned, frowning. "Yes, why?" Grace crossed her arms, hesitant. "I don't know if I belong here." Lucas sighed, holding the door open for her. "Don't worry about that right now. Let's go inside." Reluctantly, Grace followed Lucas through the lobby, trying to ignore the curious glances from the staff and residents. The elevator, with its gold finish and mirrors, looked like something out of a movie. When the doors opened to the top floor, Grace held her breath at the sight of the apartment. The living room was spacious, with large windows offering a panoramic view of the city. The furniture was modern and elegant, and everything seemed impeccably arranged, as if no one truly lived there. "This is your home?" Grace asked, still taking it all in. "It is. But to be honest, I don't spend much time here." Lucas ran a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable with his own luxury. "Come on, I'll show you where you can stay." Lucas led Grace to a small but cozy room at the back of the apartment. While it didn't have the same glamour as the rest of the place, it was more comfortable than anything Grace had experienced in years. "Here it is. You can settle in. Tomorrow, we'll figure out how you can help." Grace nodded silently. After Lucas left, she closed the door and sat on the bed, feeling the softness of the mattress. For the first time in years, she had a roof over her head and a real bed to sleep in. Still, anxiety lingered. Why was Lucas doing this? What did he really expect from her? The next morning, Grace woke up early, determined to prove she wasn't a burden. When she left the room, she found Lucas in the kitchen, dressed casually, a stark contrast to the man she'd met the day before. "Good morning," he said, holding a cup of coffee. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I expected," Grace replied. "What do you want me to do?" Lucas smiled faintly, appreciating her proactive attitude. "To start, I need help organizing some documents. My secretary's out, and I've fallen behind on a few things." Grace followed him to an office in the apartment, where a stack of papers covered a large wooden desk. Lucas quickly explained what she needed to do, and to his surprise, Grace caught on easily. While she worked, Lucas occasionally glanced at her. There was something about her that intrigued him. The way she focused on her task, as if every detail mattered, even though he knew it was just basic work. "You're good at this," he remarked, breaking the silence. Grace looked up, surprised by the compliment. "I had to learn fast. When you live on the streets, you have to be creative." Lucas nodded, sensing there was much more to her story than she was willing to share at that moment. The day passed quickly, and Grace proved to be more efficient than Lucas had anticipated. By the afternoon, he found her in the kitchen, improvising something to eat. "What are you making?" he asked, leaning against the counter. "Some pasta. Hope you don't mind," she said, stirring a pot. Lucas chuckled, shaking his head. "As long as there's enough for two, it's fine." They ate together, and for the first time, the tension between them seemed to ease. Lucas appeared more relaxed, as though he was rediscovering a part of himself he'd long forgotten. After dinner, Lucas grabbed a bottle of wine and poured himself a glass. He offered one to Grace, but she declined, saying she preferred water. "So, what do you plan to do now that you have a place to stay?" he asked, curious. Grace shrugged. "I'm not sure yet. Just getting off the streets is a big step. I think I'll focus on that for now." Lucas nodded, but something about her words unsettled him. He didn't want Grace to just survive. He wanted her to thrive. But how could he help her achieve that without coming across as overbearing? Later that evening, after Grace had gone to her room, Lucas sat alone in the living room, deep in thought. Her presence was already changing something inside him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was doing something meaningful. Grace, on the other hand, was restless, despite the comfort of the room and Lucas's generosity. She couldn't stop thinking about what might come next. What did he expect from her? And why did she feel like there was more kindness in him than he seemed to believe? The next morning, as Grace cleaned the kitchen, the doorbell rang. Lucas went to answer it, and Grace heard voices at the door. One of them was a woman's voice, sharp and familiar. When Grace stepped closer, she saw Charlotte, Lucas's ex-girlfriend, standing in the doorway with a smug smile on her face. "So, it's true," Charlotte said, looking Grace up and down. "You actually brought a homeless woman into your house." Grace felt her blood boil, but before she could respond, Lucas closed the door behind Charlotte, cutting her off from Grace's view. "What do you want, Charlotte?" Lucas asked, visibly irritated. Grace returned to the kitchen, but stayed close enough to hear. As much as she didn't want to admit it, something about the conversation intrigued her. Why was Charlotte here? And why did Lucas seem so upset? As the voices grew muffled, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that, even though she had found a place to stay, her presence in Lucas's life was about to bring complications she couldn't foresee. She pretended to stay busy in the kitchen, but curiosity got the better of her. Charlotte's haughty tone and condescending demeanor made it clear she didn't have good intentions. Grace strained to catch pieces of the conversation as Lucas's frustration became more evident. "What are you doing, Lucas?" Charlotte's voice dripped with disdain. "Have you completely lost your mind? A homeless woman living here. What will people think?" "I don't care what people think, Charlotte," Lucas replied curtly. "Grace works for me now. She's here because she needs help, and because she deserves a chance." Charlotte let out a mocking laugh. "Works for you? How long are you going to play the hero before you get bored? You and I both know she doesn't belong in your world." Grace's heart raced. Even though she didn't know Charlotte, her words hit like a punch to the gut. No matter how much she tried to ignore others' opinions, it was hard not to feel the truth in what Charlotte was saying. She didn't belong in Lucas's world. But Lucas wasn't backing down. "You don't understand, Charlotte, because you've never had to fight for anything. Grace has more courage than anyone I know, including you. Now, if you're done making your scene, you can leave." Charlotte tried to argue, but Lucas opened the door and motioned firmly for her to go. With an angry glare, she stormed out, her heels clicking loudly on the floor. When the door shut, silence filled the space. Grace, still in the kitchen, tried to look busy, but Lucas walked in, his expression serious. "Sorry about that. Charlotte is complicated," he said with a sigh. "Complicated is putting it lightly," Grace replied, without looking directly at him. Lucas let out a short laugh, but quickly grew serious again. "She shouldn't have spoken to you like that." Grace finally looked up to meet his gaze. "She's right. I don't belong here." That's not true. Lucas's voice was firm. No one has the right to decide where you belong. Grace stayed silent, surprised by the conviction in his voice. He seemed to genuinely believe what he was saying, but she wasn't sure how to process it. I'll try not to cause any problems, Grace said quietly. You're not causing problems. Lucas slipped a hand into his pocket and shifted the conversation. What do you say we take a break? I need to get out for a bit, and I think you could use it too. Grace gave him a wary look. Get out where to? You'll see. Though hesitant, Grace eventually agreed. Something in Lucas's demeanor seemed genuine, as if he really wanted to do something good for her. He led her to the elevator, and a few minutes later, they were walking through the streets of the city. Lucas stopped at a modest clothing store with good quality items and led her inside. Pick out some clothes, he said casually. No, I can't accept this, Grace replied, crossing her arms. It's not a gift. Consider it part of the job. You'll need better clothes to handle whatever comes next. Grace hesitated, but knew he was right. She picked out a few basic items, avoiding the more expensive ones. While trying on clothes in the fitting room, she overheard Lucas talking with the store clerk. He seemed comfortable anywhere, as if the whole world was his stage. After they left the store, Lucas took her to a small cafe. They sat outside, where the sounds of the city filled the quiet moments. Why do you do this? Grace asked finally, breaking the silence. Do what? Help me. You don't have to. Lucas looked at her for a moment before answering. Maybe because I need to. Grace frowned, puzzled. What do you mean? Lucas gazed at the horizon, thoughtful. I spent years building a life based on what I thought success was. Money, power, status. But deep down, none of that means much. Helping you, it makes me feel like I'm doing something real for the first time. Grace didn't know how to respond. On one hand, it was comforting to hear that. On the other, it seemed to carry an unexpected weight. After they finished their coffee, Lucas took her back to the apartment. Once there, he went straight to his office while Grace stayed in the living room, reflecting on everything that had happened that day. As she sorted through her thoughts, Grace realized there was something vulnerable about Lucas. He was a powerful man, yet he seemed burdened by regrets. It made her feel a little less out of place, as if, in some way, they were connected by their own internal struggles. That night, Grace went to the kitchen and found Lucas sitting at the table with a glass of whiskey in hand. He seemed lost in thought, but looked up when she entered. I can't sleep, she admitted, sitting in the chair across from him. Welcome to the club, Lucas replied, raising his glass. For a moment, the silence between them was comfortable. Neither knew exactly what to say, but it didn't seem to matter. They were starting to understand that perhaps they had more in common than they realized. Grace felt, for the first time in a long while, that someone was willing to listen to her. And for Lucas, she was the first person in years who seemed to see beyond the perfect facade he always presented to the world. What's your take on Lucas and Grace's connection? Hit that like button if you're rooting for them, and share your predictions in the comments. The next morning, Grace woke up to the sound of movement in the apartment. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, and, still groggy, she followed it to the kitchen. Lucas was there, dressed once again in his impeccable suit, adjusting his tie as he sipped his coffee. Good morning, he said without looking at her. Did you sleep well? Grace shrugged, grabbing a mug. Better than on the streets, for sure. Lucas smirked slightly. I've got a busy day, but I had a few things delivered here. Feel free to organize what you need. Grace nodded, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling of living in a world that wasn't hers. After Lucas left, the apartment fell silent again, but the peace didn't last long. Soon, the doorbell rang. Grace opened the door to find an elegant woman wearing an unmistakable air of superiority. Charlotte was back, unannounced this time. So, you're the famous Grace, Charlotte said, looking her up and down. Grace didn't answer immediately. Lucas is not here. I know that. I didn't come to see him. I came to see you. Grace narrowed her eyes, crossing her arms. What do you want? Charlotte stepped inside, ignoring Grace's resistance. I want to know what exactly you're doing here. Lucas isn't the type to just take people in. He barely has time for his own friends, let alone someone like you. Grace felt her blood boil, but took a deep breath. I work here, that's it. Charlotte let out a short laugh. Work? How convenient. He brought you here to ease his conscience, didn't he? I bet he's already planning the next way to get rid of you. Grace stood her ground, but inside, her insecurities began to scream. What Charlotte said echoed doubts she already had. Why was Lucas really helping, and how long would it last? I think you should leave, Grace said, keeping her voice steady. Charlotte raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her boldness. Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. When Lucas gets tired of playing hero, you'll realize you never had a place here. Without waiting for a response, Charlotte turned and left, leaving Grace alone in the doorway. Later, when Lucas returned, he found Grace sitting silently on the couch with her arms crossed. He immediately noticed something was wrong. What happened? He asked, setting down the briefcase he was carrying. Your ex was here, Grace said bluntly. Lucas frowned. Charlotte? What did she want? She said I don't belong here, that you only brought me here to ease your conscience. Lucas took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. She doesn't know what she's talking about. Don't listen to Charlotte. But she's right, isn't she? Grace shot back. I don't belong in this world. Lucas moved closer, sitting down in the chair across from her. Grace, listen. What Charlotte thinks doesn't matter. What matters is what you do with the opportunities you get. You deserve to be here just as much as anyone else. And what about you? She asked. Why did you really bring me here? Lucas hesitated, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he'd never had to put it into words before. Because I needed to change something in my life, he said honestly. Meeting you made me realize how stuck I was in my own bubble. You reminded me there are things more important than work or status. Grace didn't know what to say. There was an intensity in Lucas's voice that caught her off guard, as if, for the first time, someone truly believed she was worth something. The next day, Lucas decided to take Grace to a business social event. He knew it was a risk, but wanted to show her she could face anything, even in an environment that didn't seem to suit her at first glance. Are you sure this is a good idea? Grace asked, looking at the dress Lucas had bought for her. Absolutely. Besides, it's time some people learn to respect you. When they arrived at the event, the stares were immediate. Lucas walked in with Grace by his side, both impeccably dressed, and the murmurs around the room began at once. Some people were better at hiding their reactions than others, but most made little effort to conceal their judgment. Grace, however, held her head high. Remember, you belong here just as much as anyone else, Lucas said quietly. Grace gave a small smile, though she knew it wouldn't be easy. Charlotte was there, of course, and the moment she saw Grace, she wasted no time approaching them. So, a new companion this time, Lucas, she said, her smile dripping with venom. Before Lucas could respond, Grace did. At least I'm here by choice, she said without hesitation. Charlotte was momentarily speechless, but quickly recovered her composure. Enjoy it while it lasts. These things are never permanent. Lucas took Grace's arm, signaling it was time to move on. Later that evening, as Lucas danced with Grace in the center of the room, he couldn't help but notice how composed she seemed, even under pressure. You're handling this really well, he said. I'm trying not to let their judgment get to me, Grace replied with a slight smile. That's more than most people can do. Grace met Lucas's gaze, and for a moment, she forgot where she was. It felt like everything around them had disappeared, leaving just the two of them. Lucas felt something similar. It wasn't just admiration. It was something he couldn't quite put into words. By the end of the night, Grace realized that, despite the stares and comments, she had overcome an important hurdle. She still had doubts, but she was starting to believe that belonging wasn't about where she came from, but what she was willing to face. How's Grace holding up in Lucas's world? Give us a like if you're inspired by her strength, and tell us what you think in the comments. The next morning, Grace woke up with a sense that something had shifted. The previous night was still fresh in her mind. The cutting words, the judgmental looks, and, most of all, the dance with Lucas. Something inside her had awakened, a newfound strength she didn't yet fully understand. As she tidied up the kitchen, Lucas walked in, casually dressed, with a cup of coffee in hand. He seemed more relaxed than usual, as if some of his usual tension had eased. "Ready for the next challenge?" he asked with a slight smile. Grace raised an eyebrow. "What exactly do you mean by challenge?" "Today, we're doing something different. I want to show you that you can adapt to any situation." Grace was skeptical. Whenever Lucas used vague words, it meant he was up to something. "I need to know what's at stake before I agree," she replied. Lucas chuckled softly, taking a sip of coffee before answering. "We're going shopping, but this time, you'll pick out the clothes. No interference from me." Grace froze for a moment, processing what he had just said. "I don't need fancy clothes, Lucas. It's not about what you need. It's about what you deserve." Grace rolled her eyes, but knew resisting him was pointless. Lucas had a peculiar way of convincing her, even when she didn't want to admit it. At the store, Grace felt uneasy. The clothes hanging on the racks were far more expensive than anything she had ever touched. She ran her fingers over a silk dress, feeling the softness of the fabric, but quickly pulled back, as if even considering it was wrong. "Come on, Grace. Pick something you like," Lucas encouraged. She looked at him suspiciously. "This is a test, isn't it? You want to see if I'll give in to luxury." Lucas crossed his arms, smiling. "Maybe. Or maybe I just want you to realize you don't need to be afraid of these things." Grace sighed, and picked out a simple but elegant outfit. Lucas seemed pleased, but she still felt out of place. At the checkout counter, she saw the total on the screen and almost stepped back. "That's a lot of money, Lucas. Let me worry about it. Now, let's get something to eat." They left the store and headed to a nearby restaurant. While they waited for their order, Grace stared out the window, watching people pass by. It was strange how the world seemed so different now, even though she was still the same. "You've changed," Lucas remarked, breaking the silence. Grace turned to him, confused. "What do you mean?" "When we first met, you hesitated to accept any kind of help. Now you're starting to trust yourself more. That's a change." Grace looked away, fiddling with her napkin. "I don't know if I trust myself more. I think I'm just trying to survive like always." Lucas shook his head. "Surviving isn't enough, Grace. You need to live." His words lingered in her mind as they ate in silence. There was something about Lucas's sincerity that made her question her own beliefs. Back at the apartment, Lucas received an urgent call. He seemed worried as he spoke on the phone, pacing back and forth. "What's wrong?" Grace asked when he finally hung up. "An important meeting was moved up. I need to leave now." "Can I help with anything?" she offered, surprising herself. Lucas looked at her for a moment, as if considering the offer. "Actually, yes. Could you organize some documents in my office while I'm gone? I'll need them when I get back." Grace nodded and headed to the office. While organizing the papers, something caught her eye. A black folder with Lucas's name engraved in gold. It was different from the others, more worn, as if it had been used many times. She hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her. Opening the folder, she found old photos and newspaper clippings. One photo showed Lucas with a young man who looked like his brother. Grace vaguely remembered Lucas mentioning a brother in one of their conversations, but he had never gone into detail. There was something about Lucas's expression in the photo. Lighter, more carefree. Before she could look further, she heard the apartment door open. Lucas had returned earlier than expected. "Grace," he called, walking toward the office. She quickly closed the folder, feeling guilty. "I was organizing the documents like you asked," she said, trying to sound casual. Lucas noticed the black folder on the desk and frowned. "Did you open that?" Grace hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to invade your privacy." Lucas ran a hand through his hair. "It's not a problem. It's just something I don't share with many people." "It's your brother, isn't it?" she asked, pointing to the photo. Lucas nodded, looking at the image with a mix of sadness and nostalgia. "His name was Liam. He died in a car accident a few years ago. I was driving." Grace remained silent, feeling the weight of his words. "I'm so sorry, Lucas." He took a deep breath, as if trying to keep his composure. "Since that day, I threw myself into work. I thought if I stayed busy enough, the guilt would go away. But it never does." Grace looked at him, seeing a side of Lucas he had never shown before. For the first time, she understood why he was so hard on himself. "You don't have to carry this alone," she said softly. Lucas raised his eyes to her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "Thank you, Grace." Their conversation was interrupted by Lucas's phone ringing again. He quickly answered and left the office, leaving Grace alone once more. But something had shifted between them. For the first time, she felt there was a real connection, something deeper than gratitude or obligation. As she finished organizing the papers, Grace thought about how this man, who seemed to have everything, carried so much hidden pain. And in some way, it made her feel that maybe, just maybe, she could help him as much as he was helping her. Grace had started to realize that her presence in Lucas's life was having an unexpected effect. The conversation about Liam still echoed in her mind. The weight of guilt Lucas carried seemed to have shaped who he was, explaining much of his actions. Even so, she couldn't shake the feeling that something between them was shifting. As she tidied up the living room late that morning, the doorbell rang again. Grace went to answer it, thinking it might be another delivery, or worse, another unpleasant visit from Charlotte. But this time, it was a well-dressed man with a cold smile and an assessing gaze. "Good morning. I'm Matthew, Lucas's business partner." He introduced himself, extending a hand. Grace hesitated, but shook it. "He's not home right now." Matthew glanced around the apartment before focusing back on Grace. "And you must be the famous Grace, right?" She frowned, uneasy with the way he said her name. "That's right. How can I help you?" Matthew gave a condescending smile. "Actually, I'm not here for help. I just wanted to see for myself what Lucas has been up to lately. He's been distracted, and now I understand why." Grace felt the weight of the insinuation in his words. "I think you're mistaken. I just work here. Nothing more." Matthew chuckled softly, adjusting his jacket. "Of course. But let me give you some advice, Grace. Don't get too attached. Lucas isn't the type to hold on to things like this. He's a practical man, and people like you don't last long in his world." Before Grace could respond, Lucas arrived. He stopped at the door, narrowing his eyes as he took in the scene. "Matthew, what are you doing here?" Matthew turned with the same cold smile. "Just a friendly visit. Wanted to see how you're doing and, of course, meet your new employee." Lucas crossed his arms, clearly irritated. "If you're here to judge me, save your breath. My personal life is none of your business." Matthew shrugged. "I'm just concerned, Lucas. I wouldn't want anything distracting you from the business. After all, that's what we live for, isn't it?" Without waiting for a reply, Matthew turned and left. When the door closed, Grace crossed her arms, staring at Lucas. Seems like your friends share the same opinion about me as your ex. Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair. Ignore what he said. Matthew's a man who only cares about numbers. He doesn't understand that some things go beyond that. And do you? Grace asked, her voice carrying a curiosity she couldn't suppress. Lucas hesitated before replying. I'm trying. Grace didn't know what to say. She wanted to believe Lucas was different from the people around him, but doubts lingered in her mind. Maybe Matthew and Charlotte were right. Maybe she was just a temporary distraction in Lucas's life. Later that day, Lucas decided to step out to clear his head and invited Grace to join him. He took her to a quiet park, far from the city's frantic pace. As they walked, Grace began to relax, taking in the gentle breeze and the scent of flowers around them. Do you come here often? She asked, noticing how at ease Lucas seemed in the setting. Whenever I need to think, he replied. This is one of the few places I can unplug for a while. Grace smiled faintly, surprised to see this more vulnerable side of Lucas. Seems like you've had a lot on your mind lately. Lucas stopped and looked at her. I have, and a lot of it involves you. Grace froze, processing what he had just said. What do you mean by that? She asked cautiously. Lucas looked away, as if trying to organize his thoughts before answering. You've changed something in me, Grace. I can't explain it, but since you came into my life, I've started seeing things differently. Grace felt her heart race, but worked to keep her composure. That sounds like a good thing. Or is it not? Lucas chuckled softly. I think it's good, but it's also confusing. I'm not used to feeling this way. Grace wanted to ask more, but the sound of a phone interrupted them. Lucas answered, and his expression turned serious. All right, I'll be there right away. He hung up and looked at Grace. Something urgent came up. I have to handle it. That's fine. I can head back to the apartment on my own. No, I'll take you. Lucas led her back, but Grace couldn't shake the feeling that their earlier conversation had been left unresolved. She wanted to understand what he truly felt, but knew it wasn't the right time to push him. Back at the apartment, Grace tried to keep herself busy with simple tasks. But while organizing the office, she came across a photo of Lucas and Matthew at a formal event. She studied the picture, trying to grasp the kind of pressure Lucas faced in his world. Being surrounded by people who only cared about money and power must have been exhausting. Grace began to wonder if she really had a place in his life. She was starting to grow attached, and that scared her. Lucas might be genuine, but the world around him was ruthless. She knew that, in the end, she could just become another disposable piece in a game far bigger than she could comprehend. When Lucas returned that evening, he looked more tired than ever. He dropped his briefcase on the table and sank into the couch, rubbing his eyes. Are you okay? Grace asked, breaking the silence. Lucas let out a deep sigh. Sometimes, I wonder why I keep doing this. Doing what? Trying to keep everything balanced. Work, expectations, my personal life. It feels like I'm always chasing something, but never actually getting anywhere. Grace sat in the armchair nearby, watching him closely. Maybe you're running in the wrong direction. Lucas looked up at her, surprised by the simplicity of her answer. And what's the right direction? Grace shrugged. That's something you'll have to figure out. But from what I can see, you're more than the world around you. You just need to believe that. Lucas fell silent, absorbing her words. He didn't know why, but Grace had a way of seeing through the layers he had spent years building. They sat there quietly, but for the first time, Lucas felt he didn't need to say anything. Grace was beginning to understand his complexity, and he was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, she was the one person who truly got him. Grace spent the next few days trying to sort out her thoughts. Something about her dynamic with Lucas was changing, but she didn't know how to handle it. He was someone carrying the weight of a world completely different from hers. Yet he seemed to be searching for something only she could offer: honesty. As she cleaned the kitchen one morning, the apartment's landline rang. Lucas had already left for work, so Grace hesitated before answering. "Hello. Is this Grace?" asked a woman's voice on the other end. It was Charlotte. Grace stayed silent for a moment before replying. "Yes. What do you want?" Charlotte let out a short laugh. "I want to give you a little warning. Lucas is a practical man, and you're just a distraction. He might seem different now, but as soon as something more interesting comes along, you'll be out." Grace clenched her fists. "Maybe he's more than you think, you know, Charlotte." The woman laughed again, this time with a hint of disdain. "Be careful not to get hurt. You're playing a game you don't understand." Before Grace could respond, the call ended. She hung up the phone, trying to steady her breathing. She didn't want to let it bother her, but Charlotte's words struck a chord in an insecurity Grace couldn't ignore. When Lucas came home later that day, Grace was still deep in thought. He noticed her expression and frowned. "Did something happen?" he asked, placing his briefcase on the table. Grace hesitated before answering. "Charlotte called today." Lucas let out an exasperated sigh, rubbing his temples. "What did she say now?" "That I'm just a distraction. That you'll get tired of me." Grace looked at him, searching for some truth in his eyes. "Is it true?" Lucas stayed quiet for a moment, clearly caught off guard by the question. "No, Grace, it's not true." "Then why does she keep coming after me?" Grace crossed her arms. "And why does it feel like everyone in your world is trying to push me out?" Lucas stepped closer, his hands in his pockets. He looked at her directly, as if trying to convey all the sincerity he had. "Because they're used to a different version of me. A Lucas who did what everyone expected. But you've shown me I can be more than that. They don't understand it, and that's why they're reacting this way." Grace looked away, processing his words. She wanted to believe him, but it was hard to ignore the doubts Charlotte and others had planted. "Grace, listen. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know you matter to me right now, and that's what's important." She nodded, but the words still lingered in her mind. Even if Lucas was being honest, the world around him was relentless. She knew she had to be ready for anything. The next day, Lucas decided to take Grace to see one of the charitable projects he'd recently started supporting. It was an initiative to provide shelter for people experiencing homelessness, something he'd begun investing in after Grace entered his life. When they arrived, Grace was struck by the simplicity of the space. It wasn't luxurious, but it was functional and welcoming. A few people were gathered, receiving meals or chatting with volunteers. "You did this?" Grace asked, looking around. "Not by myself," Lucas replied humbly. "But I want to do more. After I met you, I realized how much I'd been ignoring this side of reality." Grace gave a faint smile, though there was something deeper in her eyes. "This is important. It's good to see you using what you have to make a difference." As they walked through the shelter, Grace began chatting with some of the people there. Lucas watched from a distance, noticing how easily she connected with others. Her empathy was genuine, something he deeply admired. When they left, Grace was visibly moved. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said. "It reminded me there are still good people in the world." Lucas smiled. "You're one of them." Grace felt her cheeks warm, but looked away, trying to hide her reaction. Later that day, Lucas received an urgent call from work. He had to leave again, leaving Grace alone in the apartment. As he prepared to head out, Grace stopped him at the door. "Lucas, do you think people can really change?" she asked, arms crossed. Lucas paused, surprised by the question. "I think they can, but it's not easy. Because sometimes it feels like no matter how much I try, I'll always be the girl who came from the streets." Lucas stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Grace, what defines you isn't where you came from. It's what you do with it. You've already changed far more than you realize." Grace stayed quiet, but his words comforted her in a way she hadn't expected. After Lucas left, Grace began tidying the apartment, trying to distract herself. But Charlotte and Matthew's words still lingered like a shadow. As much as she wanted to believe in Lucas, part of her feared getting too attached and ending up hurt. While cleaning the office, she came across a contact list on the desk. Among the names, Matthew's was highlighted. Grace stared at it for a few seconds, remembering his visit. He seemed like the kind of person who would do whatever it took to protect his own interests, even if it meant hurting Lucas. Grace began to wonder if Matthew and Charlotte were working together to undermine Lucas. Something about the way they spoke felt more calculated than simple concern. She put the list aside and returned to the living room, but the unease lingered. Something was brewing, and Grace knew she needed to be ready for whatever it was. Let's do something fun. For those who only read the comments, type "hot dog" in the comments. And only those who make it this far will understand. Now, back to the story. The days that followed were intense for Grace. Her relationship with Lucas had grown closer, but the doubts and insecurities planted by Charlotte and Matthew still haunted her. Lucas, meanwhile, seemed more focused than ever, trying to balance his personal life and work while giving Grace his attention. One afternoon, as Grace was organizing the living room, Lucas walked in with a serious expression. He held an envelope, his face hinting that its contents were important. "Grace, we need to talk," he said, placing the envelope on the table. Grace stopped what she was doing, feeling a lump form in her throat. "What is it?" Lucas sighed and pulled out a chair, sitting down. "It's something I've been putting off, but I think you deserve to know. It's about Charlotte and Matthew." Grace sat across from him, unsure of what to expect. "They've been pressuring me to take a path I don't want to. They want me to sell a significant part of my company to expand, but it goes against everything I believe in. And honestly, I think the fact that you're here bothers them even more." "Why?" Grace asked, confused. "Because you make me question things I've never questioned before. And that scares them because it means I might start making decisions that aren't just about money or power." Grace stayed silent, trying to process his words. There was something deeply sincere about the way Lucas spoke, but her insecurities still weighed on her. "Lucas, I don't want to be a problem for you." "You're not a problem," he interrupted firmly. "In fact, you're the only thing keeping me grounded in all of this." Grace looked away, trying to control the wave of emotions that overwhelmed her. "I just don't know if I'm strong enough to face all of this," she admitted. Lucas reached out, holding her hand gently. "You're stronger than you think, Grace. And I'm here to help you, just like you've been helping me." Later that evening, Lucas decided they needed a change of scenery. He took Grace to a quiet restaurant, far from the chaos of the city. Over dinner, Lucas seemed more at ease, and Grace began to feel more comfortable herself. "You know, Grace," Lucas said, "I never thought someone like you could come into my life and change so much in such a short time." Grace chuckled softly, fiddling with her glass of water. "Is that a good thing or not?" Lucas smiled warmly. "It's definitely a good thing." As they continued talking, Grace noticed that Lucas was becoming more open. He wasn't the same distant, work-obsessed man she'd met weeks ago. There was a newfound humanity in him that made her feel connected in a way she hadn't experienced before. On their walk back to the apartment, Lucas stopped suddenly. Grace looked at him, puzzled. "What is it?" she asked. Lucas took a deep breath, as if summoning his courage. "Grace, I need to say something, and I hope you won't run away." "I'm here, aren't I?" she replied, trying to lighten the mood. Lucas smiled faintly, but his eyes were serious. "I think I'm falling in love with you." Grace froze, stunned by his confession. She'd felt something growing between them, but hearing Lucas admit it caught her off guard. "Lucas, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything right now. Lucas assured her. "I just needed you to know. You've changed how I see the world, and I can't ignore that anymore." Grace's heart raced. Part of her wanted to believe every word, but another part was still afraid that this was only temporary. "Lucas, I need time," she said finally. "This is a lot for me to process." Lucas nodded, understanding. "I get it. I don't expect anything from you, Grace. I just want you to be happy, whatever path you choose." They continued their walk in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable one. Grace felt something shift inside her as well, though she still needed time to understand it fully. The next morning, Grace woke up with a newfound determination. She realized she needed to confront her insecurities and figure out what she wanted for her life. As she sipped coffee in the kitchen, Lucas walked in, looking tired but resolute. "Matthew called for a meeting today," he said. "It's going to be tough, but I'm ready to face him." "You'll be fine," Grace replied with a small smile. "You're stronger than you think." Lucas returned her smile, clearly grateful for her encouragement. "Thank you, Grace. That means a lot coming from you." When Lucas left for the meeting, Grace took the time alone to reflect. No matter what happened between them, she knew she needed to become more confident and independent. It was the only way she could be sure she'd have the strength to move forward if things didn't work out. Hours later, Lucas returned, exhausted but relieved. "I did it," he said, sinking into the couch. "Matthew finally understood that I'm not backing down." Grace smiled, feeling an unexpected pride. "I knew you could do it." "It's because of you, Grace," Lucas said sincerely. "You've made me realize I can be more than what they expect of me." His words struck a chord, but Grace still felt the weight of her own doubts. She wanted to believe him, but the seeds of uncertainty planted by Charlotte and Matthew lingered. As they talked, Lucas's phone rang again. He answered quickly, and Grace could tell from his tone that it was important. "Yes, schedule the meeting for tomorrow. I want to go over the next steps," he said before hanging up. Turning to Grace, he added, "It seems like things are finally falling into place." Grace nodded, but there was something in her expression that Lucas couldn't quite read. She knew she had to make a decision soon, but she wasn't ready to take that step yet. Later that night, Grace sat on the couch, staring at the city lights twinkling through the window. The apartment was quiet, almost oppressively so. Over the past few days, she'd come to realize how much her life had changed since meeting Lucas. It wasn't just about having a roof over her head or new clothes. It was the feeling that, for the first time, someone truly believed in her. Yet, doubt still lingered in her mind. Lucas had confessed his feelings, but Grace wasn't sure if she was ready to accept them. Not because she didn't feel anything, but because she was afraid. Afraid that, in the end, everything Charlotte and Matthew had said might be true, that this was just temporary. The next morning, Grace woke up determined to sort through her thoughts. As she tidied up the kitchen, Lucas walked into the room, dressed more casually than usual. "Not going to work today?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "No, I decided I needed a day off." He gave a small smile. "I thought I'd take you somewhere special." Grace raised her eyebrows. "What kind of place?" "You'll see. Put on something comfortable." She hesitated for a moment, but eventually gave in. Minutes later, they were in Lucas's car, driving along a winding road out of the city. The silence between them was comfortable, though Grace was still lost in her own thoughts. "So, are you going to tell me where we're going?" she asked after a while. Lucas shrugged, keeping his eyes on the road. "It's a surprise." Grace rolled her eyes, but couldn't help a small smile. About an hour later, they arrived at an open field where a small lake sparkled under the sunlight. Trees surrounded the area, creating a peaceful and secluded atmosphere. Lucas parked the car and stepped out, grabbing a basket from the trunk. "Is this a picnic?" Grace asked, surprised. "I thought we could use some time away from everything," he replied, holding out his hand to help her out of the car. They sat by the lake, and Lucas started unpacking the basket: fruits, sandwiches, and even a bottle of wine. Grace looked at him with a mix of disbelief and amusement. "You actually put this together?" "Of course I did. Don't think I'm capable." He grinned playfully. Grace let out a soft laugh and picked up a sandwich. As they ate, she began to relax. The calm surroundings seemed to push her worries aside, and Lucas was more laid back than she'd ever seen him. "You know, this is different from anything I've ever experienced," she said, gazing at the lake. "How so?" Lucas asked. "No one's ever done something like this for me. I've always been so focused on surviving that I never thought I could just enjoy a moment like this." Lucas was silent for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "You deserve this, Grace, and so much more." She looked away, trying to manage the wave of emotions rising within her. Lucas had a way of saying simple things that struck deeply. "Why do you do this?" she finally asked. "Because I care about you." Lucas looked at her directly, his eyes holding a sincerity Grace couldn't ignore. "I know it's hard to believe, but it's the truth." Grace stayed quiet, trying to process it all. Before she could respond, Lucas continued, "I know you're scared, Grace, but I also know you're stronger than anyone I've ever met. And I want to be by your side, no matter what path you choose." His words were exactly what Grace needed to hear, but they didn't make her decision any easier. She knew her feelings for Lucas were real, but she also knew she didn't want to rely on anyone to find her own way. When they returned to the apartment, Grace went straight to the bedroom. She needed a moment alone to gather her thoughts. Lucas respected her space, but couldn't help feeling a little anxious. He'd made his feelings clear. Now the rest was up to her. While Grace was in the bedroom, Lucas received a call from Matthew. He answered reluctantly, already guessing what the conversation would be about. "Lucas, we need to talk. It's about the decision you made in the last meeting." "I've already said I'm not changing my mind, Matthew. This isn't just about you. There's a lot at stake here. And that's exactly why I can't give in. I have to do what I believe is right, not what's most convenient." Matthew was silent for a few seconds before responding. "You're changing, Lucas. I don't know if that's good or bad, but I hope you know what you're doing." After the call ended, Lucas stood by the window, deep in thought. He knew he was going against what was expected of him, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right track. Later, Grace came out of the bedroom and found Lucas in the living room, staring out the window. She hesitated for a moment before walking over to him. "Lucas." He turned, surprised to see that she looked calmer than before. "Yes?" Grace took a deep breath, as if gathering her courage. "I want to try. I want to try something with you, but I need to do it my way. I need to keep being myself, no matter what." Lucas smiled, relieved. "That's all I want, Grace. I don't want you to change who you are. I just want to be by your side." Grace felt a wave of relief wash over her. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt like she didn't have to face it alone. The two of them sat in silence for a moment, but this time, it was a comfortable silence, full of mutual understanding. In the days that followed, Lucas continued to struggle with balancing his personal and professional life, while Grace started exploring new possibilities for her future. She knew she still had much to learn and overcome, but she finally felt she was on the right path. Lucas supported her every step of the way, encouraging her to pursue her dreams, while she helped him see beyond the corporate world he was so immersed in. One evening, as the apartment was quiet, Lucas surprised her with an invitation. "Put on something special. I have a surprise for you." Grace raised an eyebrow, curious. "A surprise, Lucas? You know I'm not a fan of mysteries. Trust me this time. You'll like it." Though hesitant, Grace did as he asked. She picked out a simple but elegant dress Lucas had bought for her during one of his many attempts to help her feel comfortable in this new world. When she stepped out of the bedroom, Lucas, already dressed in an impeccable suit, looked at her as if time had stopped. "You look stunning, Grace." She blushed, but tried to hide her nervousness. "You look pretty good yourself. So, where are we going?" "You'll see," he replied with an enigmatic smile. Lucas took her to a restaurant perched high above the city. The view was spectacular, with bright lights illuminating the skyline. Grace was speechless when she saw the table reserved for them, adorned with flowers and candles. It was the kind of scene she had only imagined in movies. "Lucas, what are you up to?" she asked suspiciously. "Just enjoy the moment," he said, pulling out her chair for her. The dinner was perfect. They laughed, talked about the little details of their lives, and for a moment, Grace felt as though there were no barriers left between them. When the waiter brought dessert, Grace noticed something different. A small envelope was resting next to her plate. "What's this?" she asked, looking at Lucas. "Open it and see." Grace picked up the envelope and carefully opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. Lucas's words were heartfelt and full of emotion. He described how she had changed his life, how her strength inspired him, and how he couldn't imagine a future without her. When Grace finished reading, she looked up to find Lucas kneeling beside the table, holding a small velvet box. "Grace, you've taught me that true love isn't about where we come from, but who we choose to be with. I want to spend the rest of my life by your side, learning from you, growing with you, and loving you every day. Will you marry me?" Grace's eyes filled with tears. For a moment, she couldn't speak, only nodded enthusiastically. Lucas smiled in relief and slipped the ring onto her finger, a symbol of everything they had overcome together. News of their engagement spread quickly among Lucas's few friends and acquaintances. Despite some skeptical reactions, he and Grace were determined to do things their way. They planned a simple ceremony, full of meaning. On the morning of the wedding, Grace was in a delicately decorated room, getting ready for the big moment. She wore a classic white dress, with subtle details that highlighted her natural beauty. Chloe, a volunteer from the shelter Grace had worked at in recent months, was by her side, helping with the final touches. "You look beautiful, Grace." Lucas won't believe his eyes. "Thank you, Chloe." Grace smiled nervously. "I still can't believe this is all happening." Meanwhile, Lucas waited at the altar, surrounded by white flowers and soft lighting. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, but his gaze was fixed on the entrance, eager to see Grace. When the music began, everyone stood. Grace walked in slowly, her heart racing. Her eyes met Lucas's, and in that moment, the world seemed to disappear. It was as if they were the only two people there. When she reached the altar, Lucas gently took her hands, the smile on his face reflecting everything he felt. "You look incredible," he whispered. Grace tried to hold back her tears, but the emotion was too overwhelming. The officiant began the ceremony, and the words they exchanged were filled with love and sincere promises. "Lucas, you showed me I was capable of so much more than I ever imagined. Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. I promise to love and support you in all our journeys. Grace, you brought color to a life that once felt empty. You showed me what it means to truly live. I promise to love and respect you every day for the rest of my life." When the officiant declared them husband and wife, Lucas pulled Grace into a gentle but passionate kiss. The applause echoed through the room, but for them, it all still felt like a dream. The reception was intimate and joyful. Lucas made sure to include people who were important to Grace, like the friends she had made at the shelter, and even some staff from the restaurant where she had worked briefly. The celebration was a blend of their worlds, proof that they could come together without losing who they were. Later, as they danced under the twinkling lights, Lucas whispered in Grace's ear, "This is just the beginning. I have so many plans for us." Grace rested her head on his shoulder. feeling completely at peace. "I don't need big plans, Lucas. I just need you." They danced for a few more moments, enjoying each other's presence. Life wouldn't always be easy, but they both knew that together they could face anything. Are you loving Lucas and Grace's journey? Click that like button if their love stories got you hooked, and share your favorite moment in the comments. Lucas and Grace's story hit me harder than I expected. It starts with Lucas, a millionaire caught up in his own world, and Grace, a homeless woman fighting to survive. Their chance meeting, him offering her a ring out of despair, her rejecting it out of pride, sets off a chain of events that's raw and real. What struck me most was how they challenged each other. Lucas, with his wealth, learns that money doesn't buy meaning, while Grace, despite her struggles, teaches him that strength isn't tied to status. Their journey from strangers to soulmates isn't just romantic, it's a wake-up call. Lucas sheds his superficial shell, finding purpose in helping Grace, and she discovers that accepting help doesn't mean losing herself. It's messy, human, and beautiful. The lesson here? We're all stuck in our own bubbles, whether it's chasing success or just getting by. But real growth happens when we step outside, connect with someone different, and let them shake up our perspective. In my life, I can apply this by looking beyond my comfort zone, listening to people I'd normally pass by, and finding value in unexpected places. It's about humility, empathy, and realizing that everyone's got something to teach you if you're willing to learn. Loved Lucas and Grace's journey? Hit that like button if it moved you, share it with your friends to spread the vibe, and subscribe for more stories that hit home. Drop a comment. What's your takeaway? Let's keep the conversation going.